Most egos in Limbus Company can fall into one of three categories: the more straightforward, simple egos, the more mechanically complex egos, or the strange, confusing egos. While most egos don't tend to fall into the last category, there's one that certainly does, and that's Lifetime Stew. No, not that one. So today I will talk about how confusing Lifetime Stew Dawn is despite only containing about a paragraph of text. Lifetime Stew Dawn Quixote is a test ego that was released with the Hell's Chicken event alongside its infamous sibling, Lifetime Stew Sinclair. Now, out of the gate, you might notice something, or rather the lack of something. Most egos and IDs released today usually contain paragraphs of text, while Lifetime Stew Dawn contains 7 sentences in this entire kit. It's kind of weird to think that was the norm back in the day, but I'm getting sidetracked. Let's talk about the actual stats of the ego. Starting with the Awakening at Threatsman 4, Lifetime Stew Dawn has 3 attack weight and rolls 25 on heads, which is standard for most TEF egos. Now, one thing that's odd about this ego is its cost, which is just 5 lost ego resources. What's odd about this isn't the amount that it costs, that's actually just slightly below average. It's the fact that it's one of the only egos in the entire game that costs just one type of resource. Not even Zayan's had that honor. Now, onto the effects on the ego, which there are just 2. One that's before the attack, which boosts the damage based on how many less resources you have, and another, which just inflicts 3 burn count on hit. There's nothing to really talk about with the burn count, but there is a surprising amount to talk about with the damage conditional. The first thing is something you might notice compared to most other damage conditionals in Limbus, which are deal plus amount of damage for every blank. The ego just says it boosts damage based on the amount of resources you have, at a limit of 50%. Because there isn't a modifier stating how much damage every resource gives, this means you have to have 50 less ego resources to have the highest amount of damage, which just isn't happening outside of Mirror Dungeon. Now, let's move on to the Corrosion, which has just as many oddities. First things first, this is a positive coin Corrosion, which Corrosions usually aren't. This can be good if you overclock at a high SP, but you probably shouldn't, and you'll see why. Now, let's read the text that comes with every Corrosion in the game, which is the fact that it's indiscriminate. But, unlike a lot of egos, one thing that makes it different is the fact that it targets the unit with the most HP of targeting randomly. This is surprisingly common with older egos. Quite a few actually have different prioritization instead of just being random. And most HP is usually better than targeting randomly because in games like Mirror Dungeon and Railway, the unit with the most HP is often the enemy. Going down a bit, we can see that it has the same boost damage conditional as the Awakening, but unlike the Awakening, it also spends additional ego resources to boost the damage. This is not very good. Spending extra resources is usually something you don't want to do, especially when the reward is just 10% more damage at a max of 120%. And that's only happening when the entire team is using a less skill and you have 12 skill slots, which is basically never happening outside of elite teams, which you're likely not using this ego in. After that, it also inflicts 4 burn count, which is 1 more than the Awakening. Now, let's move over to what I think is the most unique thing about this ego, which is the passive. The passive is quite simple, especially when compared to some of the text fests some new egos can be. It reads, at the start of the turn, convert 2 random non-lust ego resources into 1 lust resource. Now, some egos have passives that give extra resources, but none that spend resources. And that's for a good reason. Spending extra resources every turn, or every turn Dawn is alive after using the ego, especially when you can't control which resources get spent, can easily screw you over by spending your bottleneck resources or resources for vital egos. And the upside, just being 1 less resource, is too minor to really justify using the ego for the passive or even the ego at all. Especially when in a burn team which you are likely using this ego in, already generates a huge amount of loss. You are basically crippling your ego resource generation just to get more resources that you could have saved by just not using the ego in the first place. The passive makes this ego incredibly detrimental in a lot of cases. Combat this with the ego's other effects, it makes Lifetime Stew Dawn a pretty hard ego to find uses for. The most important thing for egos is how many use cases does the ego have generally. The more applicable an ego is, the better, and the less applicable usually end up at the bottom of the bunch. The ego only has 2 effects, and neither of them is all that helpful. The last thing a burn team is usually struggling with is burn count. Hell, Dawnquare alone basically solves all burn count problems, including multiple targets. And the passive seems promising, but most of the time, you'd be better off not using it since it's just more trouble than it's worth. This leads the ego into a very tough spot, as it doesn't have a compelling reason to use it that isn't incredibly niche. The only use case that I do think is worth mentioning is in solos, because both Dawn IDs with a ton of lust and no lust can benefit from it. Dawn IDs with a lot of lust can just spam the ego whenever you need a clash one, and if you Super the Sawn and the ego for free, you basically get another ego resource to use, which is especially good for BL Dawn and T-Corp Dawn, which have a hard time fueling other egos, but do have easy access to Pride resources. So in combination with Lifetime Stew, you can basically spam Dawn's base ego whenever. But even then, how often are you sewing with Dawn, let alone those IDs? I do think this does save the ego from being in the bottom tier of egos, but just barely. All in all, Lifetime Stew Dawn ends up pretty close with its brother as an ego that doesn't really accomplish anything. While it doesn't quite reach the low of Sinclair, it's still pretty bad. The thing that I believe really sets apart Lifetime Stew Dawn from the rest is what makes it bad is unique to only it. IDs and egos that are bad usually have a trait that's shared with other IDs or egos that suffer from the same problem. If I had to give Lifetime Stew a grade from F to S, I would give it a D. I don't think it's as redeemable as those who should not be named. By doing that, it just ends up not really doing anything at all, which I would honestly argue is worse than being abysmal dog shit. It's fun to talk about egos that are bad, but Lifetime Stew Dawn just ends up in the strange spot of not being bad enough to really talk about, but not really being good enough to ever mention egos to run in any given team. It ends up being overshadowed by another bad ego from the same event. Another one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this ego is I think it's a great showcase of just how strange Season 1 balancing was. The Hell's Chicken event is quite possibly the worst event in the entire game, ID and ego wise, because 3/4 of the stuff that got released is genuinely garbage. But in a weird way, I feel nostalgic for such a time because of how much of a roulette each ID and ego release was. Not saying we don't get the strange ID or ego every once in a while, Season 6 is a ton of those, but nothing to the scale that Season 1 was. Although, that's probably for the best.